When the old manor's timber scaffolding collapsed during a storm, chaos filled the estate grounds. Servants screamed, nobles scattered. But the Duke, known more for his arrogance than his courage, didn't hesitate. He dove beneath the falling beams to rescue a trapped young girl, risking his life in a moment that would rewrite his reputation. As whispers spread through the kingdom, the act that nearly killed him may be the very thing that redeems his name. Or will it expose the truth he's long tried to forget? What secret connects this girl to the Duke's buried past? And why would a man of such pride throw everything away to save her? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thornhaven Manor had stood against the English countryside for 3 centuries, its grey stone walls weathered by time and seasons, its tall windows reflecting the changing skies like watchful eyes. In the autumn of 1847, the estate wore its age with dignity, though close inspection revealed cracks in the mortar and ivy creeping where it shouldn't. The grounds stretched for miles, rolling hills dotted with ancient oaks whose leaves now burned copper and gold, their colours deepening as October settled in with its customary fog and chill. Duke Alexander Ashford rose each morning at precisely 6 o'clock. His valet, Thomas, would enter the bedchamber with measured steps, drawing back the heavy curtains to reveal whatever grey light the day offered. The Duke would dress in silence, selecting from his wardrobe of dark coats and perfectly pressed shirts, each piece chosen not for fashion, but for the authority it conveyed. By 7, he would be in his study, reviewing account books and correspondence, his breakfast taken at his desk, rather than in the dining hall where his ancestors had gathered. The staff moved through Thornhaven with practiced efficiency, though there was little warmth in their routines. Margaret, the housekeeper, had served the Ashford family for 40 years. She remembered when the Duke's mother had filled these halls with music and laughter, when visitors came regularly and the estate hummed with life. Now at 63, Margaret supervised a household that felt more like a museum than a home. She directed the maids with quiet authority, ensured the fires were lit and meals prepared, all while watching the Duke retreat further into his solitary existence. The Duke's reputation preceded him in every room he entered. At 45, Alexander Ashford was known throughout the county as a man of rigid principles and little sentiment. He attended social functions out of obligation, spoke only when necessary, and maintained his family's standing through careful calculation rather than genuine connection. His neighbours respected his title, but few claimed friendship. Even Lord Pemberton, who had known him since boyhood, remarked once that Alexander had built walls higher than Thornhaven's own. The manor itself reflected its master's nature. The drawing-room, though elegantly furnished, felt cold despite the fire always burning in its hearth. Portraits of stern-faced Ashfords lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to judge all who passed beneath them. The library held thousands of volumes, but the Duke read only histories and agricultural journals, nothing that might stir emotion or imagination. His private study, located in the East Wing, remained locked when he wasn't present, and even Margaret had limited access to clean it. On this particular morning, the scaffolding crew had arrived early to continue work on the manor's western facade. The project had been ongoing for weeks, an expensive but necessary renovation. Time and weather had worn the stonework, and several sections required reinforcement before winter. The Duke oversaw the work with his usual attention to detail, inspecting progress each afternoon and questioning any deviation from his specifications. Catherine, his younger sister, had lived in London for the past decade, visiting Thornhaven only on obligatory holidays. At 38, she had married a banker and embraced a social life her brother found frivolous. Their relationship remained cordial but distant, connected more by duty than affection. She sent letters occasionally, filled with news of parties and theatre, to which Alexander rarely responded beyond brief acknowledgements. The weight of maintaining the Ashford legacy rested entirely on Alexander's shoulders. His father, the late Duke, had been a formidable man who ruled both estate and family with an iron hand. He had demanded perfection, tolerated no weakness, and insisted the family name remain unblemished by scandal or sentiment. Alexander had learned these lessons well, perhaps too well. When his father died 15 years ago, Alexander had inherited not just the title and property, but the rigid worldview that came with them. His brief marriage, arranged for convenience and social advantage, had ended when his wife succumbed to fever after only 5 years. There had been no children, no heir to continue the Ashford line. At the time, Alexander had accepted this with the same stoic reserve he applied to all things, focusing instead on estate management and financial stability. Yet beneath the carefully maintained exterior, cracks had begun to show. The estate's finances, once robust, had grown increasingly strained. Poor harvests, declining rents, and the cost of maintaining a property this size had eroded the family fortune. Alexander spent long hours reviewing ledgers, calculating how to preserve what remained without compromising the Ashford name. He refused to sell land or dismiss staff, seeing both as admissions of failure his father would never have tolerated. Margaret noticed the changes more than most. She saw how the Duke lingered over certain account books, the lines deepening around his eyes. She remembered him as a boy, before his father's expectations had hardened him. There had been laughter then, curiosity, even tenderness. That boy had disappeared gradually, replaced by the severe man who now inhabited these halls like a ghost among memories. The villagers surrounding Thornhaven knew the Duke primarily through his transactions. He was fair in his dealings, never cheating tenants or tradespeople, but never generous either. He paid what was owed, nothing more. When illness or misfortune struck a family on his lands, he would extend deadlines for rent, but offer no charity. Charity, his father had taught him, bred dependence and weakened character. Self-reliance was the only virtue worth cultivating. Lord Pemberton visited occasionally, drawn by old friendship, despite Alexander's coldness. Pemberton was everything the Duke was not: warm, sociable, engaged with the world beyond his property lines. He had tried over the years to draw Alexander out, to remind him there was life beyond duty and reputation. But each attempt met with polite resistance, and eventually Pemberton learned to accept his friend as he was, or claimed to be. The servants spoke little of their employer, but their silence told its own story. They respected his consistency, his fairness in wages, his lack of cruelty. But they didn't love him. There was nothing to love in his measured words and careful distance. Even Thomas, who dressed him each morning and had served him for 20 years, knew almost nothing of the Duke's inner thoughts or feelings. The manor's east wing held the family's private quarters, and within them, Alexander's study remained his sanctuary. Here, behind a locked door, he kept documents spanning generations. Property deeds, marriage certificates, birth and death records, all meticulously organized and preserved. But in the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath official papers, lay a small collection of items he never showed anyone. A faded ribbon, pale blue and frayed. A single letter unsigned, its ink browning with age. And a daguerreotype, its image captured decades ago, showing a young woman whose smile seemed to light the frame from within. These items represented the one deviation from his father's path, the single rebellion that had shaped everything that followed. At 25, Alexander had fallen in love with a merchant's daughter named Sarah. She had been visiting relatives in the village, and they had met by chance at a harvest festival. For 3 months, they had conducted a careful courtship, meeting in secret, writing letters they dared not send through normal channels. She had worn a pale blue ribbon in her hair, and he had bought her another, watching her face light with joy at the simple gift. His father had discovered the relationship through servants' gossip. The confrontation had been brutal and final. The Duke's heir would not marry beneath his station. Such an alliance would taint the family name, compromise their social position, and betray generations of careful breeding. Alexander had been given a choice: abandon Sarah or be disinherited, cast out from everything he had been raised to become. He had chosen his inheritance. Within a week, Sarah had left the village. He had made inquiries, half-hearted attempts to find her, but his father had watched his every move. Eventually, Alexander had stopped looking. He told himself she was better off, that she would find happiness with someone of her own class, that he had made the responsible decision. Over time, he buried the memory beneath layers of duty and protocol, until it seemed almost like something that had happened to someone else. But he had kept the ribbon, the letter, the photograph, hidden away, never examined, yet never discarded. They remained as evidence of the man he might have been, locked away as securely as that bottom drawer. Now, 20 years later, the manor required repairs that could no longer be postponed. The scaffolding project had become necessary when inspectors noted deterioration in the western wall's mortar. Water had seeped behind the stone during years of neglect, and without intervention, entire sections risked collapse. Alexander had reluctantly approved the expense, though it strained his already troubled finances considerably. The work crew consisted of local men, experienced in restoration projects. They arrived each morning at dawn, their voices carrying across the grounds as they prepared their tools and materials. The Duke observed from his study window, noting their progress with the same attention he applied to all estate matters. He had specified which stones needed replacement, which sections required repointing, and the exact mixture of mortar to be used. The foreman, a practical man named Davies, had learned to follow these instructions precisely, knowing the Duke tolerated no deviations. Margaret moved through her daily routines with the efficiency of 4 decades' practice. She supervised the younger maids, ensuring rooms were cleaned to exacting standards even though few guests ever saw them. The silver was polished weekly, the floors waxed, the linens changed on schedule. She maintained standards not because the Duke demanded it, though he did, but because she remembered when these standards had meant something beyond mere appearance. In quiet moments, Margaret would pause at windows overlooking the grounds, remembering the estate as it had been. She recalled the Duke's mother hosting garden parties, children running through these halls, music drifting from the drawing room on summer evenings. She remembered young Alexander before his father's discipline had shaped him into something harder. There had been kindness in him once, curiosity about people beyond their titles and usefulness. That quality had disappeared gradually, like color fading from fabric left too long in sunlight. The village of Thornwood sat 2 miles from the manor, a collection of stone cottages and shops serving the surrounding farmland. Most families there had connections to the estate, either working its lands or providing services to the big house. They knew the Duke primarily through his steward, who collected rents and handled most practical matters. When Alexander did appear in the village, usually to consult with his solicitor or inspect properties, people stepped aside respectfully but without warmth. Among the village families, the Clarks lived modestly near the church. Clara Clark, a widow of 35, worked as a seamstress, taking in mending and creating simple garments for local families. She had a daughter, Emma, 9 years old, bright-eyed and curious despite their limited circumstances. Clara kept to herself mostly, attending church on Sundays but declining social invitations. She had moved to Thornwood 10 years earlier, claiming to be escaping memories after her husband's death, though few knew details of her past. Emma attended the village school when her mother could spare her from household tasks. She learned reading and figures alongside farmers' children, showing particular aptitude for her lessons. The schoolmaster, Mr. Winters, had mentioned more than once that Emma possessed unusual intelligence for a child of her station. Clara received these observations with quiet pride, but discouraged any talk of opportunities beyond what their circumstances allowed. The girl had developed a fascination with the manor, visible from certain points in the village. She would sometimes walk the public path that skirted the estate's boundary, gazing at the great house with its many windows and vast grounds. Clara discouraged this interest, redirecting Emma's attention to practical matters. There was no point, she believed, in the child dreaming of worlds beyond her reach. Better to accept one's place and find contentment within it. On the day the scaffolding was scheduled for inspection, storm clouds had been gathering since morning. The foreman, Davies, had considered postponing the work, but the Duke's schedule demanded adherence. They would complete the inspection regardless of weather, unless conditions became truly dangerous. The crew assembled their equipment, checking rope tensions and plank placements, while wind began gusting across the exposed western wall. Margaret had noticed the darkening sky and ordered the shutters secured on the manor's windward side. She directed maids to move valuable items away from windows, following procedures established through generations of storms. The Duke remained in his study, reviewing correspondence and occasionally glancing toward the construction site. He wore his signet ring as always, the heavy gold band bearing the Ashford crest. The ring had passed from father to son for 200 years, its weight both literal and symbolic on his hand. The morning had brought Emma Clark to the manor grounds, though she had no business being there. Her mother had sent her to deliver mending to the housekeeper, a simple errand that should have taken no more than half an hour. But the girl's curiosity had gotten the better of her, as it often did. She had lingered near the construction site, fascinated by the scaffolding's intricate structure and the workers moving across it like spiders on a web. Margaret had received the bundle of mended linens at the kitchen door, paying Emma the coins owed and expecting the child to depart immediately. But when she glanced out 20 minutes later, she spotted the small figure still wandering the grounds, drawn toward the western wall where men shouted instructions to one another over the rising wind. The housekeeper made a mental note to speak with Clara about keeping better watch over her daughter, though she understood how difficult that could be for a woman working alone. The wind had strengthened considerably by mid-morning, carrying the scent of rain and turning leaves into small tornadoes that danced across the lawn. Davies consulted with his men about securing their equipment and retreating until the weather passed. The scaffolding had been built sturdy, designed to withstand typical autumn storms, but the gusts were proving stronger than anticipated. Several workers had already descended, coiling ropes and moving tools to shelter. Alexander had emerged from his study to observe the situation, his coat buttoned against the chill as he crossed the grounds. He approached Davies with questions about the structure's stability and the timeline for completion. The foreman assured him everything had been constructed to proper standards, though he recommended waiting until conditions improved before continuing work. The Duke had nodded, accepting this professional judgment, though his expression showed displeasure at the delay. It was then that Emma had moved closer to the scaffolding's base, captivated by its towering height and complex arrangement of beams and platforms. She had never seen such construction up close, and her young mind tried to understand how such a thing was built. The workers, focused on securing equipment and seeking shelter from the first drops of rain, hadn't noticed her approach. Margaret, glancing from a window, felt sudden alarm, but was too far away to call out effectively. The wind hit with unexpected force, a gust that bent trees and tore at roof tiles. The scaffolding, already stressed by the weather, shuddered visibly. Davies shouted a warning, though to whom wasn't clear in the chaos. The Duke, standing 30 feet away, turned at the sound and saw both the structure's distress and the small figure beneath it. Time seemed to compress in that moment, his mind calculating angles and trajectories, measuring the distance between himself and the child against the speed of the collapse he could see beginning. Later, people would debate what happened in those seconds. Some would claim the Duke moved on instinct, without thought or hesitation. Others would suggest he had recognized something in the girl, some quality that compelled his action. Margaret, watching from the window, would remember only the shock of seeing him run, his careful composure abandoned entirely as he sprinted across the wet grass toward danger rather than away from it. The first beam broke with a crack like thunder, and the entire western section of scaffolding began folding inward. Emma looked up at the sound, her child's mind not quite grasping the danger descending upon her. She stood frozen as timber and rope twisted in the air above her, as men shouted and scattered, as the Duke closed the distance between them with speed that seemed impossible for a man his age. He reached her perhaps 2 seconds before the first heavy beam would have struck. His arms wrapped around her small body, and he threw them both sideways, covering her with his larger frame as the world came crashing down. The sound was tremendous, wood splintering and metal fittings shrieking, dust rising in clouds that mixed with rain. Davies and his men watched in horror, unable to help, certain they were witnessing 2 deaths instead of 1. When the collapse finally settled, when the last beam had fallen and the dust began to clear, a terrible silence held the grounds. Margaret had both hands pressed to her mouth, unable to breathe or move. The workers stood motionless, shocked beyond action. Then someone saw movement in the wreckage, and the paralysis broke. Davies reached the wreckage first, his hands shaking as he began pulling away lighter pieces of timber. Other workers joined him immediately, working with desperate efficiency to clear debris. They could see the Duke's coat, dark wool now covered in dust and splinters, and beneath him the small form he had shielded. Blood stained the wood where a beam had caught his shoulder, but he was conscious, his breathing labored but steady. The housekeeper had run from the manor, her skirts hiked up, moving faster than anyone had seen her move in years. She called instructions to the workers, directing them to lift carefully, to watch for shifting weight that might cause further collapse. Thomas appeared with blankets, and 2 footmen brought a door removed from its hinges to serve as a stretcher. The household staff moved with coordinated purpose, their usual formality abandoned in crisis. They extracted the Duke first, easing him away from Emma with extreme care. His left arm hung at an odd angle, clearly broken, and deep gashes crossed his back where timber edges had caught him. His face was grey with pain, but his eyes remained fixed on the child, watching to ensure she was freed safely. He tried to speak, but Margaret hushed him gently, pressing a cloth to the worst of his wounds. Emma came out next, unconscious but breathing. Her dress was torn and muddy, her hair had come loose from its braid, but miraculously she appeared less injured than her protector. A bruise darkened her forehead where she had struck something during the fall, and her breathing seemed shallow. But she had been spared the crushing weight that had fallen on the Duke's back. The workers laid her carefully on a second blanket, and Margaret dispatched a maid to run for Dr. Hartwell in the village. The Duke insisted on sitting up despite protests, needing to see that Emma was alive. When he confirmed her chest rising and falling with breath, some tension left his features. He looked at his injured arm as though it belonged to someone else, then at the destruction surrounding them. The scaffolding lay in ruins, months of work undone in seconds. Davies was already calculating the cost, both in materials and in guilt for not evacuating sooner. Thomas and a footman helped the Duke to his feet, supporting him on both sides as he swayed slightly. He refused the stretcher, stating he could walk to the house, though each step clearly cost him. Margaret followed close behind, watching for signs he might collapse, while 2 maids carried Emma between them with the tenderness usually reserved for precious china. The rain had begun falling steadier now, washing blood from stone and turning dust to mud. Inside the manor, they brought the Duke to his chambers and Emma to a guest room nearby. Margaret moved between both, directing servants, sending urgent messages, ensuring both patients were warm and as comfortable as possible until the doctor arrived. She had seen injuries before, had nursed the old Duke through his final illness, but this felt different somehow. The wrongness of seeing her employer, usually so controlled and distant, bleeding and vulnerable, unsettled something deep in her understanding of how the world worked. Word spread through the household with remarkable speed. Servants gathered in doorways, speaking in hushed tones about what they had witnessed. The Duke had saved a child. The Duke, who barely acknowledged their existence, who never showed emotion, who lived behind walls of propriety and distance, had thrown himself into danger for a girl he didn't know. They struggled to reconcile this action with the man they served, finding no place in their understanding of him for such selflessness. Dr. Hartwell arrived within the hour, His bag clutched tightly as he took the stairs 2 at a time despite his age. Margaret directed him first to Emma, and he examined her with practiced efficiency. The head wound concerned him, and the shallow breathing suggested possible rib damage, but she showed no signs of crushing injuries or internal bleeding. He cleaned and bandaged her cuts, applied cold compresses to the bruising, and stated she needed rest and observation. Children were resilient, he noted, and if she woke within the next few hours, her prognosis would be excellent. The Duke's injuries proved more severe. The broken arm required setting, a process he endured without sound, though sweat beaded his forehead. Deep lacerations across his back and shoulders needed cleaning and stitching, and Dr. Hartwell suspected cracked ribs from the impact. He worked methodically, noting with approval that infection hadn't yet set in, though the next few days would prove critical. Someone had to inform Clara Clark that her daughter lay unconscious in the manor. Margaret sent Thomas with instructions to be gentle but clear, to bring the woman back immediately, and to say nothing that might cause panic on the journey. The valet departed with his usual efficiency, though his face showed the strain of the day's events more than he would have liked. In his chambers, the Duke lay propped against pillows, his torso wrapped in bandages and his arm immobilized in a sling. Dr. Hartwell had administered laudanum for the pain. Though Alexander had resisted initially, wanting to keep his faculties clear, the doctor had insisted, noting that shock and agony would do more harm than the medicine's fog. Now the Duke drifted in a strange twilight state, aware but detached, his mind processing events with dreamlike slowness. Margaret sat in a chair by his bedside, something she had never done in all her years of service. The impropriety of it would have scandalized her in normal circumstances, but these were not normal circumstances. She watched him carefully, noting the shallow breaths that suggested painful ribs, the occasional grimace when the laudanum's effect waned slightly. When he opened his eyes and seemed lucid, she spoke softly, telling him the girl lived and the doctor expected her recovery. His response surprised her. He asked about Emma's hands, whether she still held anything when they pulled her from the debris. Margaret frowned at the odd question, but confirmed that yes, the child had been clutching something, a torn piece of fabric or ribbon, perhaps, though it had been too dirty to identify clearly. The Duke closed his eyes at this information, and something crossed his features that might have been relief or might have been dread. Margaret couldn't quite name it. The sound of rapid footsteps announced Clara's arrival before Thomas could properly announce her. The seamstress burst into the hallway with the desperation of any mother whose child is hurt, her usual composure shattered by fear. Margaret met her outside Emma's room, gripping her shoulders firmly and explaining the situation in clear, measured tones. The girl was alive, unconscious but breathing. The doctor expected full recovery with rest and care. Clara pushed past into the room, and the sight of Emma lying so still and small in the large bed broke something in her careful restraint. She sank into the chair beside her daughter, taking the child's hand in both of hers, whispering words too soft for others to hear. Margaret withdrew quietly, giving the woman privacy with her grief and relief. Though she stationed a maid nearby in case the doctor needed to be summoned again, it was perhaps 20 minutes later when Emma stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, confusion clouding them as she tried to understand where she was and why everything hurt. Clara's face appeared above her, tears streaming freely now, and the girl managed a weak smile that said she recognized her mother even through the fog of injury. Dr. Hartwell returned immediately when called, examining her responses, asking simple questions that she answered correctly if slowly. The doctor pronounced himself satisfied with her condition. She had been fortunate, he explained to Clara, spared serious injury by the man who had covered her body with his own. Without the Duke's intervention, the child would certainly have died. The falling timber would have crushed her without question. Clara listened to this explanation with a strange expression, gratitude mixed with something else, something Margaret couldn't quite read but found unsettling nonetheless. When Emma was stable enough to speak more, She asked about the man who had saved her. She remembered strong arms grabbing her, remembered being pushed down and covered, remembered the terrible sounds of breaking wood all around. But she hadn't seen his face clearly, didn't know who he was. Clara explained carefully that the Duke of Thornhaven himself had rescued her, that he had been badly hurt doing so, and that they owed him a debt beyond repayment. Emma processed this with a child's directness. She wanted to thank him, she said. Her mother tried to explain that the Duke was resting, that he was injured and needed quiet, but the girl insisted with surprising firmness. She needed to see him, to know he was alive, to say the words her mother had taught her to say when someone did kindness. Margaret, listening from the doorway, found herself moved by the child's determination. After consultation with Dr. Hartwell, they agreed to allow a brief visit once the Duke was more alert. It would do no harm, the doctor reasoned, and might ease both patients' minds to see each other alive. Margaret went to prepare the Duke's chambers for receiving a visitor, an unprecedented event in her memory. The master never received anyone in his private rooms, certainly not a village child. The laudanum had worn thin enough for Alexander to think more clearly, though pain pulsed through his shoulder and back with each breath. He lay in his bed watching shadows move across the ceiling as afternoon gave way to evening. His mind kept returning to that moment when he had seen the child beneath the collapsing scaffolding, the instant decision that had moved his body before conscious thought could intervene. He had not planned heroism. The idea would have seemed absurd to him hours earlier. Yet something in that split second had overridden every instinct of self-preservation, every calculation of risk and benefit. He had simply moved, driven by an impulse he couldn't name or understand. Now, in the aftermath, he struggled to reconcile this action with everything he believed himself to be. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her expression careful. She informed him that the child had woken, that she was asking to see him, that her mother was with her. Alexander felt something tighten in his chest. He wanted to refuse, to claim exhaustion or pain as excuse, but found he couldn't form the words. Some part of him needed to see her alive and conscious, needed confirmation that his impulsive action had achieved its purpose. They brought Emma to him perhaps an hour later, when the light outside had faded to purple dusk. Clara carried her daughter carefully, the child's legs still too unsteady for walking. Margaret had arranged a chair beside the Duke's bed, and they settled Emma into it, propping her with cushions. The girl looked small and fragile, bruises darkening on her pale skin, but her eyes were alert and fixed on the Duke with unmistakable curiosity. For a long moment neither spoke. Alexander found himself studying her features with an intensity that should have felt inappropriate, but somehow didn't. The shape of her face, the set of her eyes, the way she held herself even injured. Something familiar echoed in her appearance, though he told himself it was merely the laudanum playing tricks with his perception. Emma broke the silence first, as children often do, with simple directness. She thanked him for saving her life, using the formal words her mother had clearly coached her to say. But then she added her own question, asking why he had done it, why he hadn't run away like everyone else. The adults in the room tensed at this boldness, but the Duke found himself appreciating her honesty. He had no good answer to give her. He told her truthfully that he didn't know, that he had simply acted without thinking. This seemed to satisfy her in a way elaborate explanations wouldn't have. She nodded seriously, as though his confusion made perfect sense to her young understanding. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out the torn ribbon, now cleaned of mud but still frayed and damaged. The Duke's breath caught. Even dirty and torn, he recognized it immediately. Pale blue silk, the exact shade he had chosen 20 years ago, the ribbon he had given to Sarah as a token of affection she couldn't wear publicly. His mind raced through possibilities, trying to construct innocent explanations for why this child would possess such a thing. Perhaps ribbons of this color were common. Perhaps it was mere coincidence. But Clara's face, when he looked at her, told him otherwise. She had gone pale, her eyes fixed on the ribbon in her daughter's hand with an expression of pure horror. She reached for it quickly, too quickly, trying to take it from Emma with words about it being ruined and needing disposal. The child protested, saying it was special, that her mama had told her it belonged to someone important, that she should keep it safe. The room fell into uncomfortable silence. Margaret sensed something significant passing between the adults, but couldn't identify its nature. Dr. Hartwell, who had stayed to monitor both patients, glanced between them with professional concern. Emma, oblivious to the tension, held the ribbon against her chest protectively, insisting she wanted to keep it. Alexander forced words through a throat gone suddenly dry. He asked, with careful casualness that fooled no one, where the child had gotten such a ribbon. Emma looked to her mother for permission before answering. Clara's expression showed defeat and resignation, as though a long-feared moment had finally arrived. She nodded slowly, giving the child permission to speak. Emma explained that it had been her mama's, that it came from someone special before Emma was born, that her mama's sister had worn it. The words tumbled out innocently, without understanding of their weight. She said her mama's sister had been beautiful and kind, but she had died when Emma was very small, too small to remember. The ribbon was one of the few things left from her. The following days passed in a haze of laudanum and uncomfortable thoughts. Dr. Hartwell visited twice daily to check the Duke's wounds and change dressings, pronouncing himself satisfied with the healing, though warning that full recovery would take weeks. The broken arm would need months in the sling. The ribs would ache well into winter, and the lacerations across his back would leave permanent scars. Alexander accepted these pronouncements with his usual stoicism, though his mind was elsewhere entirely. Emma had been released to her mother's care after 2 days of observation. Clara had thanked the household staff with quiet dignity, accepted Margaret's offer of supplies and medicines for the child's continued recovery, and departed with Emma wrapped in blankets. The girl had waved goodbye to the Duke from the doorway of his chambers, and he had raised his good hand in acknowledgement, feeling something twist painfully in his chest that had nothing to do with broken ribs. Margaret noticed the change in him immediately. He had always been withdrawn, but now he seemed to have retreated even further into himself. He spent hours staring at nothing, barely touching the meals she brought, responding to questions with single words or silence. She found him once at his desk, the locked drawer pulled open, though he closed it quickly when she entered. Whatever he had been examining, he clearly didn't want witnesses. Lord Pemberton arrived on the 3rd day, having heard news of the incident through the efficient network of county gossip. He found Alexander in the drawing room, still moving stiffly, but insisting on leaving his chambers despite the doctor's advice. Pemberton embraced his friend carefully, mindful of injuries, then stepped back to study him with concern that went beyond physical healing. They sat together as afternoon light slanted through tall windows, speaking little at first. Pemberton recounted what he had heard, how the story had spread through villages and estates, how people were talking about the Duke's heroism with genuine admiration. Alexander listened without expression, neither dismissing the praise nor acknowledging it. When Pemberton mentioned that some found his action surprisingly uncharacteristic, the Duke's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Eventually, Pemberton asked the question that had brought him here beyond friendly concern. He asked why Alexander had done it, what had possessed him to risk his life for a child he didn't know. The Duke's answer came slowly, carefully measured. He said he had acted without thinking, that there had been no time for decision or calculation, that he couldn't explain his own behavior in terms that made rational sense. Pemberton studied his friend's face and saw something there that troubled him. He had known Alexander since boyhood, had watched him transform from open-hearted youth to closed-off nobleman. He recognized the signs of inner turmoil beneath that carefully maintained surface. After a long silence, he asked gently if there was more to this than simple heroism, if perhaps Alexander knew the child or her family. The Duke's hesitation lasted a moment too long before he denied any connection. Pemberton didn't press further, but his expression showed he didn't quite believe the denial. He spoke instead about old times, about the year they had both been 25, about the mistakes young men make and the consequences they carry. Alexander stiffened at this direction, and Pemberton backed away from whatever edge he had approached. Before leaving, Pemberton offered advice that seemed to address something unspoken. He said that secrets have a way of emerging regardless of how deeply buried, that truth tends toward light, even when kept in darkness. He suggested that sometimes the brave thing wasn't throwing oneself beneath falling timber, but facing what one had avoided for years. Alexander thanked him for the visit with cold politeness that clearly indicated the conversation was over. Alone again, the Duke returned to his study and unlocked the bottom drawer. He removed the daguerreotype and studied Sarah's face in the fading light. 20 years had passed since that image was captured, yet he remembered her exactly as shown. The slight smile, the intelligence in her eyes, the ribbon in her hair. He had been so certain of his world then, so confident in the rightness of his choices. Now everything felt uncertain. The child's age matched perfectly with the timeline of Sarah's disappearance. The ribbon couldn't be coincidence. Clara's reaction had confirmed recognition, even if she hadn't spoken it aloud. And Emma herself, when he looked at her carefully, showed features that might have been his own, reflected through feminine softness and Sarah's beauty. Margaret found him there an hour later, the photograph still in his hand, his eyes distant. She entered quietly, setting down a tea tray she knew he wouldn't touch. When he didn't acknowledge her presence, she spoke his name gently, the way she had when he was a boy. He looked up then, and she saw something in his face that made her heart ache, with a sorrow she couldn't fully name. She asked permission to speak plainly, something she rarely did. When he nodded, she told him she had served his family for 40 years, that she had watched him grow from child to man, that she knew him better perhaps than anyone living. She said she had seen him examining that photograph before, late at night when he thought no one noticed. She had never asked about it, respecting his privacy, but perhaps the time for silence had passed. Alexander remained still for a long moment. Then slowly he told her about Sarah, not everything but enough. The merchant's daughter he had loved, his father's fury, her sudden departure. He admitted he had searched briefly, then given up, letting duty overcome feeling. He didn't mention the ribbon directly or speak his suspicions about Emma aloud, but Margaret was perceptive enough to understand what he wasn't saying. The housekeeper listened without interrupting, her weathered hands folded in her lap. When he finished, she asked a single question. She asked if he had ever learned what happened to Sarah after she left. He admitted he hadn't, that he had deliberately avoided seeking information, afraid of what he might discover. Margaret nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. She told him then that she remembered Sarah, though they had never been formally introduced. She had seen the girl at the Harvest Festival that year, had noticed the way young Alexander looked at her, the way his entire demeanor changed in her presence. Margaret had hoped privately that the romance might survive his father's disapproval. She had believed the boy she knew would fight for what mattered. When he hadn't, when he had chosen his inheritance instead, something in her opinion of him had shifted permanently. The words were gentle, but carried weight that struck deeper than any accusation. Alexander felt them settle like stones in his chest. He had disappointed not just Sarah, not just himself, but even the servants who had watched him grow. The realization that Margaret had carried this quiet judgment for 20 years unsettled something in his carefully constructed self-image. She stood to leave then, but paused at the door. She said that Emma Clark seemed a good child, bright and kind, despite modest circumstances. She said the girl had his eyes, the same deep grey blue that marked the Ashford line. She said this observation was hers alone so far, but that others might notice given time and proximity. Then she departed, leaving him alone with implications that felt like walls closing in. That night Alexander barely slept. His injuries ached despite the laudanum, but physical pain seemed insignificant compared to the turmoil in his thoughts. He kept returning to Emma's face, to the resemblances he had noticed, to the timeline that matched so perfectly. If she was his daughter, and the evidence increasingly suggested she was, then what did that mean? What did he owe her? What did he owe Sarah's memory? By morning, he had reached a decision. He needed to know the truth definitively, needed to hear it from Clara herself. The not knowing had become intolerable. Whatever consequences followed from that knowledge, he would face them. He had spent 20 years running from uncertainty, letting it fester in locked drawers and avoided thoughts. That approach had protected nothing and cost everything that mattered. He summoned Thomas and dictated a message to be delivered to Clara Clark. He requested her presence at the manor, alone, for a private conversation regarding matters that concerned them both. He kept the wording formal but not threatening, an invitation rather than a summons. He didn't expect her to come willingly, but he hoped curiosity or obligation might compel her acceptance. The message was delivered by mid-morning. Thomas returned with word that Mrs. Clark would attend him that afternoon, once she had arranged care for Emma. The valet's expression showed he understood this was no ordinary social call, though he said nothing about it. Alexander spent the intervening hours attempting to prepare for a conversation he had no idea how to conduct. Clara arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, dressed in her best dark gown, her hair pulled back severely. Margaret showed her to the drawing room where the Duke waited, then withdrew with instructions they were not to be disturbed. The housekeeper closed the doors firmly behind her, though she positioned herself nearby in case either party needed assistance. She told herself this was from concern for the Duke's injuries, though truthfully she wanted to be close if the conversation turned difficult. Alexander stood when Clara entered, though the movement clearly pained him. They regarded each other across the room with the wariness of adversaries preparing for battle. She looked older than he remembered, worn by years of work and worry, but still recognizably the younger sister of the woman he had loved. He could see Sarah in her features, a ghostly resemblance that made his throat tighten. He invited her to sit, and she accepted with visible reluctance. They observed formalities briefly. His thanks for bringing Emma to visit during his recovery, her gratitude for saving the child's life. These pleasantries felt hollow, performance masking what both knew they had really come to discuss. Eventually, Alexander dispensed with pretense and spoke directly. He told her he remembered her, though they had never been properly introduced. He knew she was Sarah's younger sister, knew she had been perhaps 14 or 15 during the brief period of his courtship. He asked if Sarah had spoken of him to her family, if Clara knew about their relationship. She confirmed she had known, that Sarah had confided in her, that she had hoped her sister's romance might lead somewhere despite the class difference. Alexander asked what happened to Sarah after she left Thornwood. Clara's expression hardened at this question, and when she answered, her voice carried an edge he deserved. She said Sarah had gone to London initially, found work in a dressmaker's shop, lived quietly. She had been pregnant when she left, though she had told no one except Clara. She had the baby alone, with only Clara present, in a rented room too small and too cold. The Duke absorbed this information like physical blows. He had suspected, but hearing it confirmed, stripped away any remaining doubt or hope for alternative explanations. He asked, though he already knew the answer, whether Emma was that child. Clara nodded once, sharply. She said Sarah had died of fever when Emma was 2 years old, worn down by poverty and hardship and the strain of raising a child alone. Clara had taken Emma, raised her as her own, moved to Thornwood where no one knew their history. Alexander asked why Sarah hadn't told him about the pregnancy, why she hadn't reached out for help. Clara's laugh was bitter. She said Sarah had tried. She had sent a letter to the manor shortly after leaving, asking to speak with him, explaining her situation. The letter had been intercepted by his father, who had visited Sarah personally. The old Duke had paid her handsomely to disappear permanently and never contact his son again. He had threatened worse if she refused. The revelation struck Alexander like another collapsing scaffolding. His father had known about the pregnancy, about Sarah's circumstances, and had deliberately kept this information from him. Had paid to ensure his son never learned he had a child. The betrayal felt absolute, reaching across the grave to poison everything Alexander had believed about duty and family honor. Clara continued speaking, her words tumbling out after years of enforced silence. She said Sarah had taken the money only to ensure the baby's survival. She had never spent it on herself, had saved every penny for Emma's future. She had made Clara promise to keep the child's parentage secret, believing firmly that Emma would be better off as a seamstress's daughter than as a nobleman's bastard. She had wanted her daughter spared the cruelty and judgment that illegitimacy would bring. Alexander struggled to find words. He asked why Clara had come to Thornwood, why she had brought Emma to the very place Sarah had wanted her kept away from. Clara explained that 10 years had passed, that she had believed enough time had elapsed for safety. She had needed work, had skills in sewing, and Thornwood was large enough for anonymity but small enough for opportunity. She had thought they could live quietly, unknown, that the Duke would never notice one seamstress and her child among dozens of village families. He asked what she would do in his position. Margaret considered carefully before answering. She said she would consider what Sarah had wanted, what Emma needed, what would serve the child's best interests rather than his own desires for redemption or relationship. She noted that Emma had survived 9 years without a father, had Clara's steady love and guidance, lived simply but contentedly. Disrupting that stability for the sake of his conscience might be selfishness disguised as honesty. But she also said that secrets had a way of emerging regardless of precautions. Village gossip was already speculating about his interest in the child. Catherine would arrive soon with her questions and observations. Lord Pemberton clearly suspected something beyond simple gratitude. And Emma herself was growing older, more perceptive, more capable of noticing resemblances and connections. How long could this pretense realistically continue before it collapsed under its own weight? Alexander had no answers to offer. He felt trapped between impossible alternatives, paralyzed by competing obligations and fears. Margaret's advice, while wise, provided no clear path forward. Every direction seemed to lead toward some form of betrayal, whether of Emma's trust, Clara's wishes, Sarah's memory, or his own belated recognition of responsibility. That evening, he returned to his study and retrieved the unsigned letter he had found years ago, the one he now understood Sarah had written. The feminine script was faded but still legible. She had kept their secret, she wrote, but he must keep his distance. For everyone's sake. The words carried weight they hadn't possessed when he first discovered them. Back when he had assumed they referred to protecting reputations rather than an unborn child. He wondered what Sarah would tell him if she could speak now. Would she condemn his original abandonment? Probably. Would she approve his current caution, or demand he acknowledge Emma regardless of consequences? He couldn't know. The dead offered no counsel, only absence that living people struggled to interpret according to their own needs and guilt. Catherine arrived on a Thursday morning in early November, her carriage rattling up the drive with typical lack of subtlety. She swept into Thornhaven like a force of nature, embracing her brother carefully before stepping back to examine him with sisterly scrutiny. She declared him too thin, too pale, and clearly not taking proper care of himself despite Margaret's best efforts. Alexander endured this assessment with patient resignation, knowing argument would be futile. Over lunch, Catherine demanded details about the scaffolding incident. She had heard various versions through London gossip, each more dramatic than the last, and wanted the truth directly. Alexander provided a factual account, minimizing the danger and his injuries, emphasizing luck over heroism. His sister listened with visible skepticism, clearly sensing gaps in the narrative, but uncertain where to press for more. She asked about the child he had saved, her tone carefully casual. Alexander explained briefly that Emma Clark was the daughter of a village seamstress, that she had recovered fully from her injuries, that she occasionally visited to express gratitude. Catherine's expression showed this explanation satisfied nothing. She asked why a village child would have ongoing access to the Duke of Thornhaven, why he would entertain such visits, What exactly about this situation warranted continued attention? Alexander felt his carefully maintained composure begin to crack. He said shortly that he saw no harm in brief visits from a child whose life he had saved, that common courtesy required he ensure her complete recovery, that Catherine was reading complications into simple kindness. His sister studied him with eyes that had known him since childhood, that could detect lies beneath polished surfaces. She said nothing more on the subject then, but her silence carried more threat than questions would have. That afternoon, as if summoned by unfortunate timing, Emma arrived for her scheduled visit. Catherine happened to be in the entrance hall when Margaret showed them in, and the meeting Alexander had hoped to avoid became inevitable. He performed introductions with stiff formality, noting how his sister's gaze moved between Emma and himself with unmistakable assessment. Catherine was gracious to Clara and charming to Emma, asking the child about her schooling and interests with apparent genuine curiosity. Emma responded with her usual open enthusiasm, telling Catherine about her favorite books and her ambitions to perhaps become a teacher someday. Clara remained guarded, clearly uncomfortable with this additional scrutiny, but unable to leave without rudeness. The Duke watched his sister interact with his daughter, seeing Catherine's mind work behind her pleasant expressions. She noticed everything, the resemblances he had tried to deny. Emma's grey-blue eyes, the way the child moved and gestured with unconscious echoes of Ashford mannerisms. When Emma mentioned she liked visiting because the Duke told her interesting stories and didn't talk down to her like many adults did, Catherine's smile took on knowing quality that made Alexander's stomach tighten. After Clara and Emma departed, Catherine wasted no time. She asked Alexander directly if Emma was his daughter. The blunt question, delivered in the privacy of his study, left no room for evasion. He considered denying it, constructing elaborate alternative explanations, but found himself suddenly exhausted by deception. He told his sister yes, though he asked how she had concluded this so quickly. Catherine laughed without humor. She said she had suspected from his letters, which mentioned the child far more than warranted if she were truly just a grateful stranger. Seeing Emma confirmed it immediately. The resemblance was obvious to anyone who knew the Ashford features. She asked who the mother was, whether she knew about Emma's parentage, what Alexander intended to do about this rather significant complication. He told her about Sarah, about their brief romance, and his father's intervention, about discovering only recently that his abandoned love had been pregnant, had died in poverty while he lived in ignorance. Catherine listened with growing distress, her anger building not at Alexander's youthful romance, but at their father's deliberate cruelty. She had her own grievances against the old Duke, his controlling nature and rigid expectations, but this betrayal exceeded even her low opinion of him. She asked if Emma knew. Alexander explained that she didn't, that Clara had raised her without knowledge of her father's identity, that Sarah had wanted it that way to protect her daughter from scandal and social cruelty. Catherine considered this silently, her sharp mind working through implications and possibilities. Finally, she asked what her brother wanted to do, setting aside for a moment what he should do or what others expected. Alexander struggled to articulate desires he barely understood himself. He said he wanted to know Emma, to be part of her life in whatever capacity circumstances allowed. He wanted to ensure her future was secure, that she had opportunities beyond what a seamstress's daughter might normally expect. But more than these practical considerations, he simply wanted her to know he existed, that she had a father who cared even if he couldn't claim her publicly. Catherine listened without interruption, then delivered her opinion with characteristic directness. She said he was being cowardly again, just as he had been at 25. He was trying to have things both ways, maintaining connection without accepting consequences, wanting relationship without risking reputation. She asked him pointedly whether he had learned nothing from losing Sarah, whether he intended to repeat the same mistakes with different justifications. Her words stung because they carried truth he had avoided acknowledging. Alexander defended himself weakly, arguing that the situations were different, that Emma's welfare required consideration, that public acknowledgement would damage her more than help. Catherine dismissed these arguments as rationalizations. She said Emma would learn the truth eventually, either through his conscious choice or through circumstance and gossip. Better she learn it from him, in context of love and acceptance, than discover it through cruel whispers or accidental revelation. But what of the scandal? Alexander countered. What of Emma's chances for marriage, for acceptance in any social sphere? An acknowledged bastard belonged nowhere, too elevated for common society, yet forever barred from nobility. How was condemning her to that liminal existence an act of love? Catherine's response was fierce. She said scandal faded, but family endured. That people who would judge a child for circumstances of her birth weren't worth courting anyway. That money and title provided shields against most social consequences, if one had courage to use them. She reminded him that he was Duke of Thornhaven, not some minor gentleman subject to others' approval. He set standards rather than following them. If he claimed Emma publicly, provided for her openly, challenged anyone to question his daughter's place in his life, most would eventually accept it simply because he commanded them to. Those who didn't could be ignored or confronted. The power of his position offered protections he seemed determined not to use. Alexander felt something shift in his thinking. Catherine's arguments finding purchase where Margaret's gentle counsel and his own guilt had not. His sister spoke from pragmatic strength rather than moral platitude. She wasn't asking him to be selfless or noble, merely to use the considerable power he possessed to protect what he claimed to value. When framed that way, continued silence seemed less like protection and more like the cowardice she accused him of. But Clara, he said, Clara wanted secrecy, believed firmly that acknowledgement would harm Emma. How could he override the wishes of the woman who had raised his daughter, who had shouldered burdens that should have been his? Catherine's expression softened slightly. She acknowledged this complication, said Clara's perspective deserved respect and consideration. But she also noted that Clara's judgment was clouded by years of hardship and fear, that she might be protecting Emma from imagined dangers while ignoring real needs. She suggested Alexander speak honestly with Clara, lay out options and consequences clearly, allow her to make informed decisions rather than choices based on outdated fears. Perhaps together they could find solutions that served Emma's best interests better than either could alone. Catherine offered to participate in these conversations, to provide a woman's perspective and mediate between competing positions. The discussion continued through dinner and into evening, Catherine pressing her arguments with relentless logic, while Alexander's defenses gradually crumbled. She had always possessed this ability to see through his carefully constructed justifications to the fears beneath them. Now, as in childhood, she refused to accept his excuses or let him hide behind propriety and duty. Before retiring, Catherine made one final observation. She noted that Alexander had risked his life without hesitation to save Emma from physical danger, had thrown himself beneath falling timber without calculating consequences or protecting himself. Yet he couldn't bring himself to risk reputation and social standing to give her his name and protection. She asked which danger was truly greater, which risk really mattered, which choice demonstrated actual courage versus mere impulse. Alone in his chambers afterward, Alexander sat with his sister's words echoing in his mind. She was right, he realized with uncomfortable clarity. He had been brave for 30 seconds beneath the scaffolding, but cowardly for weeks afterward. He had saved Emma's life but wouldn't claim it. The contradiction felt suddenly intolerable, a hypocrisy he could no longer rationalize or ignore. Catherine remained at Thornhaven for several days, using the time to investigate the situation more thoroughly. She visited the village under pretense of shopping, speaking with shopkeepers and tradespeople, gathering information about Clara and Emma's circumstances. What she learned both impressed and troubled her. Clara was respected for her skill and integrity, known as a devoted mother who worked tirelessly to provide for her daughter. Emma was well-liked, bright and kind. showing no signs of the hardship that had marked her early years. But Catherine also heard the whispers, the speculation about why the Duke took such interest in a seamstress's child. Some assumed he felt responsible for her injuries, despite having prevented worse. Others wondered if perhaps there was some connection no one had discovered, though they couldn't imagine what it might be. A few voices, quieter but more cynical, suggested improper motives that made Catherine's blood boil. She realized Alexander's continued attention was creating exactly the scandal he hoped to avoid, just in different form. She brought these observations to her brother over breakfast, laying out how his current approach satisfied no one and protected nothing. The ambiguity of his relationship with Emma created more suspicion than honest acknowledgement would. People imagined worst explanations when given insufficient information. Meanwhile, Emma remained ignorant of her heritage. Clara lived in constant anxiety about discovery, and Alexander himself was clearly miserable with the deception. Catherine proposed a direct approach. She suggested they speak with Clara together, present a united family front, explain the resources and protections available to Emma, if acknowledged. She believed Clara's resistance came partly from feeling alone against the weight of nobility and social judgment. Perhaps knowing Emma would have an aunt as well as father, seeing the Ashford family willing to embrace her, might change Clara's calculations about what was possible and safe. Alexander agreed reluctantly, recognizing the wisdom in Catherine's strategy, even while dreading the conversation. They sent word to Clara requesting a meeting, emphasizing this concerned Emma's future and involved no threats or demands. Clara agreed to come alone, leaving Emma with a neighbor, her acceptance suggesting she, too, felt the current situation had become unsustainable. She arrived on a grey November afternoon, the sky heavy with approaching rain. Catherine received her warmly, offering tea and ensuring she felt comfortable before turning to serious matters. Clara sat stiffly in the drawing room that had witnessed so many difficult conversations, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her expression guarded but resigned. Catherine began by acknowledging Clara's sacrifice and dedication. She thanked her for raising Emma with obvious love and care, for protecting her from hardships that might have broken a less devoted guardian. She said these years of care created debts the Ashford family could never fully repay, but they hoped to offer support going forward in whatever form Clara deemed appropriate. The approach was skillful, positioning Clara as partner rather than adversary, emphasizing gratitude rather than obligation. Alexander watched his sister work with admiration, recognizing diplomatic abilities he had never developed. Clara's posture softened slightly, though wariness remained in her eyes. Catherine moved to the central question. She asked what Clara wanted for Emma's future, not what she feared or what she thought possible, but what she truly wanted if circumstances were ideal. Clara struggled to answer, so accustomed to limiting her dreams to survive disappointment. Eventually, she admitted she wanted Emma to have education, opportunities, security. She wanted her daughter to make choices based on desire rather than necessity, to never know the grinding poverty and uncertainty that had marked her own life. Catherine nodded as though this confirmed her expectations. She said the Ashford family could provide all of this, either through discreet support or public acknowledgement. She outlined what the latter would mean. Emma would be recognized as Alexander's daughter, given his name if she chose it, educated as befitted her station, provided for through inheritance and settlement. Yes, there would be scandal initially. Yes, some doors would close, but others would open, and money combined with determination could overcome most social obstacles. She spoke of her own connections in London, families who valued character over convention, who would accept Emma into their circles once initial gossip faded. She mentioned boarding schools, known for educating girls of complicated backgrounds, where Emma would find peers and opportunities impossible in Thornwood. She painted a picture of possibility that Clara had never allowed herself to imagine. Clara listened to Catherine's vision with visible conflict. Hope warred with fear across her features, desire for Emma's betterment, struggling against protective instincts honed through years of hardship. Finally, she spoke with quiet intensity. She said Catherine painted beautiful pictures, but pictures weren't reality. She had lived as a poor relation to minor gentry before her marriage, had seen how society treated those on its margins. An acknowledged bastard, even one with money and connections, would face cruelty that Catherine in her privileged position couldn't fully understand. Catherine didn't dismiss these concerns, but countered them with examples. She spoke of other families who had navigated similar situations. Children born outside marriage who had nevertheless found acceptance and happiness. She acknowledged the path wouldn't be easy, but argued it would be honest, which carried its own dignity and strength. She asked Clara to consider whether protecting Emma from possible cruelty was worth denying her father, family, and the resources that could transform her future. Alexander had remained silent through this exchange, letting his sister advocate where his own words might carry too much self-interest. Now Clara turned to him directly. She asked what he truly wanted, not what Catherine advised or society expected, but what his heart demanded. He met her gaze steadily, finding words that had eluded him for weeks. He said he wanted to know his daughter. He wanted Emma to know she had a father who valued her, who regretted deeply his absence from her life, who would dedicate his remaining years to ensuring her happiness and security. He said the scaffolding incident had shown him how fragile life was, how quickly everything could end. He had wasted 20 years hiding from truth and consequence. He didn't want to waste whatever time remained. Clara's expression shifted, something in his plain honesty reaching past her defenses. She asked what he would tell Emma, how he would explain his sudden appearance in her life as father rather than benefactor. Alexander admitted he didn't have perfect answers, only commitment to truth told gently. He would explain about loving her mother, about circumstances that separated them, about not knowing of Emma's existence until recently. He would make clear that Sarah's choices came from love and protection, not rejection or shame. There was a long silence. Then Clara said something that changed everything. She said they were all proceeding on incomplete information, making plans based on assumptions rather than full truth. She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. She placed it on the table between them and carefully unwrapped it. The silver locket gleamed in the afternoon light, its surface worn but still beautiful. Catherine leaned forward with curiosity, while Alexander stared at it with sudden recognition. He had seen it before, though not in 20 years. It had belonged to Sarah, a gift from her mother. Clara opened it carefully, revealing its contents. Inside lay a lock of dark hair, carefully preserved, and a miniature portrait no larger than a coin. The portrait showed a young man's face rendered in exquisite detail, painted with skill that captured not just features, but something of character and expression. Alexander looked at his own face from 20 years past, seeing himself as he had been when he loved Sarah, before duty and disappointment had hardened him into what he became. Catherine drew in a sharp breath, understanding immediately what this meant. Clara's voice was quiet but steady as she explained. Sarah had commissioned this portrait from a traveling artist shortly before leaving Thornwood, painted from memory and description. She had kept it with her always, along with the lock of hair she had taken one night when he slept. She had wanted Emma to know her father's face, even if they could never meet. Clara continued, saying Sarah had made her promise to give Emma the locket on her 16th birthday, along with a letter explaining everything. Sarah had wanted her daughter to know the truth eventually, once she was old enough to understand complex situations and make her own choices about what kind of relationship, if any, she wanted with the father who hadn't known she existed. Alexander reached for the locket with trembling hands. Catherine placed her hand over his, steadying him. Clara watched them both with an expression mixing resignation and relief, as though finally speaking truths she had carried too long alone. She said she had debated whether to follow Sarah's wishes or continue the deception indefinitely. Alexander's rescue of Emma had complicated everything, made Sarah's planned timeline impossible to maintain. Clara reached into her other pocket and withdrew a sealed letter, its paper yellowed, but the wax seal intact. Sarah's handwriting marked the envelope, Emma's name written in careful script. Clara explained that Sarah had written this in the final days of her life, when fever made clear she wouldn't survive to see Emma grow up. The letter contained everything Sarah wanted her daughter to know about her father, their love, the circumstances of separation, and why she had made the choices she did. Alexander stared at the letter as though it might burn him. Catherine asked gently if Clara had read it. She shook her head, saying the seal remained unbroken because Sarah had made her promise to deliver it unopened. Whatever Sarah wanted to tell Emma was meant for her daughter alone, though Clara understood generally what it must contain. Sarah had been explicit about wanting Emma to know her father's identity eventually, believing truth was kinder than permanent deception. Catherine asked why Clara had resisted acknowledgement so fiercely if Sarah herself had intended revelation. Clara's answer came with visible emotion. She said Sarah's plan assumed Emma would learn the truth at 16, old enough to understand complexity and protect herself emotionally. She would have years of stable childhood behind her, a strong sense of identity independent of parentage. Learning at 9 was entirely different. The child was still forming her understanding of the world and herself. Such knowledge now could damage her in ways it wouldn't later. But Clara also admitted the current situation had become untenable. Emma's regular visits to the manor were creating exactly the gossip and speculation Clara had hoped to avoid. The child's growing attachment to the Duke meant eventual revelation would be even more complicated, tangled with established relationship dynamics. And Clara herself was exhausted from years of secrets and vigilance, tired of protecting Emma from a truth that seemed determined to emerge regardless of precautions. Alexander finally found his voice. He asked if he could read Sarah's letter, if Clara would allow him that much, even if Emma remained ignorant for now. Clara considered this request seriously before refusing gently. She said the letter was Sarah's final communication to her daughter, meant for Emma's eyes first. If Emma chose to share it afterward, that was her decision to make. But Clara wouldn't betray Sarah's intention by showing it to Alexander first, no matter how much he might deserve or desire to know what it contained. He accepted this with difficulty, but without argument, recognizing the boundary was appropriate, even if painful. Catherine asked what Clara proposed they do now, given everything that had been revealed. The question hung in the air heavily, all three adults aware that the decision made in this room would shape Emma's entire future. Clara spoke slowly, working through thoughts she had clearly been wrestling with since the scaffolding collapse. She said perhaps they could find middle ground. Emma could know Alexander was her father without the formal public acknowledgement that would create immediate scandal. She could understand her heritage privately while continuing to live primarily with Clara, avoiding the disruption of being uprooted into nobility overnight. As she grew older and more capable of handling complexity, they could gradually expand the acknowledgement until eventually, perhaps around the age Sarah had originally intended, Emma could make her own choices about how public her connection to the Ashford family became. Catherine considered this proposal thoughtfully. She noted it would require exceptional discretion from everyone involved, that even private knowledge had ways of becoming public in small communities. But she agreed it might serve Emma's needs better than either complete secrecy or immediate full revelation. The approach honored both Sarah's wisdom in waiting and the reality that circumstances had forced earlier disclosure. Alexander asked when they would tell Emma how they would explain everything in ways a 9-year-old could understand. Clara suggested soon, before gossip did the work for them more cruelly. She proposed they tell Emma together, presenting it as something all the adults agreed was right and good, removing any sense of scandal or shame. They would emphasize the love between her parents, the circumstances that separated them, and Alexander's genuine ignorance of her existence until recently. Catherine offered to be present as well, providing female support and representing the family Emma would be joining. She suggested they frame it positively, focusing on Emma gaining a father and aunt rather than on complications and difficulties. Children often accepted remarkable truths more easily than adults expected, especially when presented with love and unity rather than conflict and doubt. They agreed to tell Emma the following Sunday afternoon, giving everyone several days to prepare emotionally and practically for the conversation. Alexander spent those days in restless anxiety, rehearsing words that never sounded adequate. How did one explain to a child that her entire understanding of her identity was incomplete? That the man she thought was simply kind was actually her father? That her mother had kept secrets out of love, not deception? Catherine proved invaluable during this preparation period. She worked with Clara to anticipate Emma's questions and reactions, developing strategies for addressing confusion or distress. She consulted with Margaret about preparing the drawing room for the meeting, ensuring the space felt warm rather than intimidating. She even spoke with Dr. Hartwell confidentially, asking his advice about supporting a child through significant emotional revelation. Margaret, once informed of the plan, threw herself into preparations with typical efficiency. She understood better than anyone what this moment meant for Alexander, having watched him carry the weight of Sarah's loss for 20 years. She hoped this revelation, however difficult, might finally allow him to move forward from guilt and regret that had shaped him for too long. Lord Pemberton visited during this period, and Alexander found himself confiding the full truth to his oldest friend. Pemberton listened without judgment, though his expression showed he had suspected much of this already. He offered encouragement, reminding Alexander that courage came in many forms, that this honest conversation required bravery equal to any physical act. He promised discretion and support, saying the Ashford family would have allies, regardless of how society responded to eventual public knowledge. The night before the planned conversation, Alexander couldn't sleep. He sat in his study reviewing the estate's financial documents, calculating exactly what resources he could dedicate to Emma's future. He drafted preliminary instructions for his solicitor regarding settlements and provisions, ensuring legal protections would be in place regardless of what happened. The practical arrangements gave him something concrete to control when everything else felt uncertain and fragile. He thought about Sarah constantly during these days, wishing desperately he could speak with her one more time. He wanted to apologize for failing her, to promise he would do better by their daughter, to ask forgiveness he likely didn't deserve. The locket sat on his desk, open so he could see his younger self staring out. He barely recognized that man, so confident in his world's permanence, so certain of his choice's rightness. Catherine found him there near dawn, having heard him moving about and guessed he hadn't slept. She sat with him in companionable silence for a while before speaking. She told him that Sarah had clearly loved him, that the locket and letter proved she had wanted Emma to know her father eventually. Whatever mistakes he had made at 25, he had the opportunity now to be the father Emma deserved. That opportunity was rare and precious, worth whatever discomfort or sacrifice it required. Sunday arrived with deceptive normality. The sky held November's characteristic grey, neither stormy nor clear. Church bells rang in the village as they always did. Servants performed their usual routines, though Margaret had ensured everyone understood the afternoon required exceptional privacy and quiet. The drawing room had been prepared carefully, fire burning warm, comfortable seating arranged to feel intimate rather than formal. Clara brought Emma precisely at 2:00. The child wore her best dress, clearly sensing this visit was somehow different, though not understanding why. She greeted the Duke and Catherine cheerfully, noting with pleasure that Catherine would be joining them today. Alexander's throat tightened at her innocent happiness, knowing the conversation ahead would change everything regardless of how carefully they handled it. They settled together, the adults positioning themselves so Emma felt surrounded by supportive presence rather than confronted. Margaret brought tea and small cakes, the ordinary ritual providing familiar comfort. Emma chatted about her week at school, a story about a spelling competition she had won, completely unaware of the tension vibrating beneath adult composure. Finally, when delay became impossible, Clara took Emma's hand gently. She said they had something important to tell her, something about her family and where she came from. Emma's expression shifted to curiosity, mixed with slight concern, the way children look when sensing adults are about to share serious information. She asked if something was wrong, if she had done something bad. Alexander quickly reassured her that nothing was wrong, and she had done nothing but bring joy to everyone who knew her. Clara began with the ribbon, asking Emma if she remembered where it came from. Emma nodded, saying her mama had told her it belonged to someone special, her mama's sister who had died. Clara confirmed this gently, then began telling Sarah's story. She spoke of her older sister as a kind, intelligent woman who had worked hard and dreamed of a better life. She explained that Sarah had fallen in love with someone she shouldn't have, someone from a different world. Emma listened with focused attention, her young mind working to understand. She asked who Sarah had loved, whether it was someone bad. Clara quickly explained that no, he wasn't bad at all, just from circumstances that made their love complicated. She said Sarah's love had been a duke, someone very important, someone Emma actually knew. The child's eyes widened with dawning comprehension. She looked between Clara and Alexander, her expression moving through confusion toward understanding. Before she could ask, Alexander spoke, his voice rougher than intended. He told her that he had been the one who loved Sarah, that he had been young and hadn't known what to do when his father objected. He said he had made terrible choices, had let Sarah leave without fighting for her, and had only recently learned she had been expecting a baby when she went away. Emma processed this carefully. She asked in a small voice whether she was that baby. Clara confirmed it, explaining that Sarah had been Emma's mother, not just her aunt, that she had raised Emma alone for 2 years before dying, and Clara had taken over afterward. Emma's face showed shock but not distress, her mind still sorting through implications. Catherine spoke then, her voice warm and steady. She told Emma that this meant the Duke was her father, that she was part of the Ashford family, that Catherine herself was her aunt. She emphasized this wasn't bad news, but good news, that Emma was discovering she had more family who cared for her, who wanted her in their lives. She said sometimes truth was complicated, but it was still better than not knowing. Emma turned to Alexander with an expression that broke his heart. She asked why he hadn't come to find them, why he had let her mother struggle alone. The question held no accusation, only genuine curiosity about how such things could happen. Alexander found himself choking on words, struggling to explain without making excuses. He told her honestly that he hadn't known, that Sarah had tried to contact him, but his father had prevented it, that he had been weak and hadn't searched hard enough when Sarah first left. He said these were his failures, things he deeply regretted, but that he couldn't change the past, no matter how much he wished to. All he could do was try to be the father she deserved from this moment forward, if she would allow it. Emma sat quietly, her small hand still in Clara's, absorbing everything. Finally, she asked what this meant for her life, whether she would have to leave Clara and go live at the manor. The fear in her voice was evident, and Clara quickly reassured her that no, they would continue living together as always. Emma could visit the manor as much or as little as she wanted, but her home remained with Clara, who had raised her and loved her all these years. Alexander added that he wanted to know her better, to spend time with her, to help ensure her future was secure and full of opportunity. But he didn't want to take her away from the life and people she loved. He said she could decide how much or how little contact she wanted with him, that he would follow her lead and respect her comfort. Emma looked at the adults surrounding her, seeing their anxious faces and careful expressions. Then, with the directness that children sometimes achieve, she asked if this meant she could call him Papa if she wanted to. Alexander felt tears prick his eyes, unable to speak. He nodded, not trusting his voice. The child considered this gravely. She said she would need time to think about everything, that it was a lot to understand all at once. But she also said she was glad to know the truth, glad to understand where she came from. She reached out tentatively and took Alexander's hand, holding it carefully, as though testing how it felt. He gripped her small fingers gently, overwhelmed by the simple contact. Catherine suggested they look at the locket together, so Emma could see the portrait and understand how much her mother had valued knowing her father's face. Clara retrieved it from her pocket and opened it, showing Emma the miniature painting and lock of hair. Emma studied Alexander's younger face intently, comparing it to the older man before her. Clara then produced Sarah's letter, explaining its purpose, and that her mother had written it shortly before dying. She said Emma could choose to read it now or wait until she felt ready, that there was no rush. Emma held the sealed envelope reverently, tracing her mother's handwriting with one finger. She asked if she could read it privately in her own time. The adults agreed immediately, respecting her need for space to process such significant correspondence alone. The conversation continued more easily after that initial revelation. Emma asked practical questions about what having a duke for a father meant, whether she was nobility now, what people would think. Alexander and Catherine worked together to provide honest but reassuring answers. They explained that for now, only the people in this room would know the full truth. Emma would continue her normal life, but with the knowledge that she had a father and family who would support her always. Emma asked about Sarah, wanting to know more about her mother beyond the fragments Clara had shared over the years. Alexander found himself describing their brief courtship, careful to keep details appropriate for a child, but honest about the depth of feeling they had shared. He told Emma that Sarah had been intelligent and kind, that she had laughed easily and dreamed of better things. He said loving her had been the best thing he had ever done, and abandoning her the worst. Catherine added her own memories, though she had been only 18 at the time, and her brother had hidden the relationship well. She remembered glimpses of Alexander during those months, how he had seemed somehow lighter, more fully alive than she had seen him before or since. She told Emma that love like her parents shared was rare and precious, worth honoring even when circumstances prevented it from flourishing as it should have. The afternoon wore on, tension gradually easing as Emma's acceptance became clear. She asked if she could see more of the manor, if her father would show her rooms she hadn't visited before. Alexander agreed eagerly, grateful for the chance to do something concrete after so much emotional difficulty. They toured the house together, Catherine and Clara following at a discreet distance, allowing father and daughter space to navigate this new dynamic. Emma's natural curiosity reasserted itself as they walked. She asked questions about portraits, about history, about why certain rooms were kept closed. Alexander answered patiently, finding unexpected pleasure in sharing his family's story with his daughter. When they reached the portrait gallery, Emma studied his parents' painting with new interest, understanding now how her grandmother's death and grandfather's rigidity had shaped the man before her. She paused before the portrait of Alexander's late wife, the woman he had married for convenience rather than love. Emma asked gently if it had made him sad, marrying someone he didn't love the way he had loved Sarah. Alexander struggled with how to answer truthfully, without burdening her with adult complications. He said eventually that he had made many choices based on duty rather than happiness, and that he was only now learning those might not have been the wisest decisions. In his study, Alexander showed Emma the desk where he worked, the shelves of account books and estate records. She asked if someday she might learn about managing such things. The question surprised him, revealing a mind already thinking about futures and responsibilities. He told her that if she wanted to learn, he would teach her everything he knew. Women rarely received such education, but he saw no reason his daughter shouldn't understand the workings of property and finance. Emma noticed the locked drawer, asking with childlike directness what he kept there. Alexander hesitated only briefly before opening it, showing her the daguerreotype of Sarah, the original pale blue ribbon, and the unsigned letter. These were pieces of her history too, he realized, not just his private relics of grief and guilt. Emma touched the ribbon carefully, comparing it to her own torn piece. She asked if they could put them together, restore what had been damaged. Catherine suggested they have the ribbons professionally repaired and preserved, perhaps mounted in a frame with the daguerreotype and locket, creating a memorial to Sarah that Emma could keep. The idea resonated with everyone, providing tangible action when emotions threatened to overwhelm. They could honor Sarah's memory together, as the family she had helped create, even if she couldn't live to see it united. As the afternoon faded toward evening, Clara said they needed to leave, that Emma required time to rest and absorb everything. The child agreed, looking tired but not unhappy. Before departing, she hugged Clara tightly, then turned and hugged Alexander with equal intensity. She whispered that she was glad he was her father, glad to finally know the truth. He held her carefully, afraid his emotion might frighten her, whispering back that knowing her was the greatest gift he had ever received. The days following the revelation brought unexpected complications. Word had spread through the village, despite everyone's best efforts at discretion, that something significant had occurred at the manor. The seamstress's daughter spending entire afternoons there, the Duke's sister involved, private conversations behind closed doors. Speculation intensified, morphing into rumors that grew more elaborate and less accurate with each retelling. Some suggested the Duke intended to formally adopt Emma, making her his heir in absence of legitimate children. Others whispered darker possibilities about improper relationships or hidden scandals finally emerging. A few, closer to truth than they realized, wondered if perhaps there was blood connection no one had previously suspected. The gossip created exactly the social pressure Clara had feared, forcing decisions about public acknowledgement sooner than anyone had planned. Alexander found himself summoned by Lord Pemberton, who arrived at Thornhaven with unusual formality. His friend's expression was troubled as he explained what he had been hearing in the village and among neighboring estates. People were talking, and their speculation was threatening reputations. Pemberton urged Alexander to clarify the situation publicly before rumors solidified into accepted falsehood that would be harder to correct. Catherine agreed with Pemberton's assessment. She had been receiving letters from London acquaintances who had somehow heard whispers of scandal involving her brother. The network of county gossip extended further and faster than any of them had anticipated. She argued that controlled revelation would be far preferable to letting speculation run wild. They needed to claim the narrative before others defined it for them. Clara was adamant in her opposition. She reminded them of their agreement to keep knowledge private until Emma was older and better prepared. She pointed out that the child had only just learned the truth herself, was still processing what it meant, and wasn't ready to face public scrutiny and judgment. Forcing acknowledgement now would be a betrayal of Emma's trust and well-being for the sake of managing adult reputations. The debate continued over several tense meetings. Alexander found himself torn between competing loyalties and concerns. He wanted to protect Emma from premature exposure to social cruelty. He also recognized that whispered speculation might ultimately harm her more than honest acknowledgement. And beneath all practical considerations ran a deeper current, his own desire to claim his daughter publicly, to stop hiding a relationship that had become the most important thing in his life. Emma herself seemed unaware of the adult turmoil swirling around decisions about her future. She visited the manor regularly, growing more comfortable with calling Alexander Papa in private, spending hours learning estate management and history from him. She had read Sarah's letter alone in her room, emerging with tears but also peace, saying her mother's words had helped her understand everything better. She kept the letter with her always, a tangible connection to the mother she barely remembered. The child's happiness made the adult's arguments more difficult. She had accepted the private revelation well, was thriving with knowledge of her heritage and father's presence. Why disrupt that contentment with public acknowledgement that would inevitably bring complications? Yet the rumours were growing more persistent, and some were already beginning to reach Emma's ears through schoolmates repeating things overheard from parents. One afternoon, Emma asked Alexander directly about the whispers she had heard. Another girl at school had said terrible things, accusations Emma didn't fully understand but knew were meant to be hurtful. She wanted to know if she should tell people the truth, if it would make the gossip stop. Her innocent question crystallized the issue's urgency. They could no longer protect her through silence when that silence was being filled with poison by others' speculation. Alexander called another meeting with Clara, Catherine, and Pemberton. He began by acknowledging that their careful plan had been overtaken by circumstances. The choice was no longer whether to make their relationship public, but when and how. Waiting longer would only allow rumors to become more entrenched and damaging. He proposed they move forward with formal acknowledgement, but with careful preparation and unified family support. Clara's resistance had weakened under the weight of Emma's questions and distress. She asked what form this acknowledgement would take, what exactly they intended to tell the world. Alexander outlined his thoughts, shaped by discussions with his solicitor. He would issue a formal statement acknowledging Emma as his natural daughter, born of a relationship with Sarah before either of them married. He would provide for her through legal settlements and inheritance, giving her the Ashford name if she chose to take it. Catherine insisted they needed to prepare Emma properly before any public announcement. The child deserved to understand what acknowledgement would mean for her daily life, what changes to expect, what challenges she might face. They spent an afternoon explaining gently but honestly. Some people would be kind, others cruel. Some doors would open, others close. Her life would change in ways both wonderful and difficult, but her family would stand with her through all of it. Emma listened with remarkable composure for someone so young. She asked thoughtful questions about school, about friends, about whether people would treat her differently. When Alexander admitted they probably would, she considered this seriously. Finally, she said that if being honest meant facing some unkindness, it was still better than hiding and letting people make up lies. Her simple wisdom shamed the adults who had been circling the issue with so much complexity. Alexander spent days crafting the public declaration, writing and rewriting until the words felt right. He consulted his solicitor about legal language and implications, ensuring Emma's rights and inheritance would be properly protected. The document needed to be clear enough to silence speculation, but dignified enough to honor Sarah's memory and Emma's innocence. He showed drafts to Catherine and Clara, accepting their suggestions for softening harsh phrases or clarifying ambiguous passages. The final document was formal but warm, acknowledging his relationship with Sarah Clark as a genuine love affair that his father had opposed for reasons of class. He stated plainly that Sarah had been pregnant when they separated, that he had not known of Emma's existence until recently, and that discovering his daughter had been among the greatest blessings of his life. He expressed regret for circumstances that kept them apart, but joy at their reunion. He formally acknowledged Emma as his child and named her his heir, with full legal protections and provisions. They decided to make the announcement at a formal gathering, inviting local gentry, village leaders, and key figures from surrounding estates. The approach was bold, confronting potential opposition directly, rather than allowing scandal to build through whispered corridors. Catherine handled the invitations, her London connections and social skills ensuring proper form was observed even while the content would shock attendees. Margaret threw herself into preparations with fierce dedication. She ensured the manner looked perfect, that refreshments would be elegant but not ostentatious, that every detail reinforced the family's unity and strength. She had waited 20 years to see Alexander acknowledge his mistakes and claim his daughter. Now that the moment approached, she was determined it would proceed with dignity worthy of both the Duke and the child he had found. Lord Pemberton pledged his public support, promising to stand beside Alexander during the announcement and to challenge anyone who spoke against Emma. His backing was significant, carrying weight among the county gentry. Others would follow his lead, at least initially, and his friendship provided crucial foundation for social acceptance. Pemberton told Alexander privately that he was proud of him, that this took more courage than the scaffolding rescue. The night before the gathering, Alexander couldn't sleep. He walked the manor's halls, remembering his father's rigid presence in these rooms, the expectations and demands that had shaped every aspect of his youth. He thought about Sarah, wondering what she would think of how things had unfolded. He hoped she would approve, hoped his acknowledgement of Emma honored her memory rather than exposing their daughter to cruelty Sarah had sought to prevent. In his study, he opened the desk drawer and removed the artifacts that had sustained him through weeks of uncertainty. The daguerreotype, both ribbons now professionally joined and mounted in a silver frame, the locket with its miniature portrait and lock of hair. Tomorrow, these would be displayed openly, physical evidence of the love story he was about to share publicly. No more hiding, no more locked drawers and secret regrets. Emma arrived early on the morning of the gathering, bringing Clara, who looked pale but resolute. The child wore a new dress Catherine had commissioned, simple but fine, appropriate for acknowledging noble heritage without appearing presumptuous. Her hair was pulled back with the repaired blue ribbon, claiming her mother's token openly. She seemed nervous but determined, understanding this day would define much of her future. Catherine took Emma aside for a private conversation, aunt to niece, preparing her emotionally for what was coming. She told Emma that some people in the gathering would disapprove, might say unkind things or show their displeasure through cold silence. But others would be supportive, would recognize the courage it took for everyone involved to choose honesty over convenience. She urged Emma to hold her head high regardless of individual reactions, to remember she had done nothing wrong and deserved respect simply for existing. Guests began arriving at 2 o'clock, their carriages forming a line along the drive. Curiosity brought them more than courtesy, rumors having spread enough to ensure excellent attendance despite short notice. They entered the drawing room with expectant faces, speculating quietly about what announcement could possibly require such formal gathering. Some had guessed close to truth, others imagined scenarios far from reality. Margaret greeted each arrival with perfect composure, directing servants to take coats and showing guests to seats arranged in a semicircle facing the room's center. The atmosphere held tension beneath polite conversation, everyone aware they were witnessing something significant but uncertain what form it would take. Lord Pemberton positioned himself prominently, his presence signaling to others that whatever came, it had his approval. Alexander waited in his study with Emma, both dressed formally, both trying to manage nervousness through small talk that convinced neither. Catherine stayed with them, providing steadying presence and last reassurances. Clara had chosen to remain in the background, feeling her presence might complicate the narrative Alexander needed to tell. She watched from a corridor where she could see but not be seen, her hands clasped tightly. When all guests had assembled, Margaret came to inform them it was time. Alexander took Emma's hand, feeling it small and slightly damp with perspiration in his own. He looked down at his daughter, seeing both Sarah's beauty and his own features reflected in her young face. She looked up at him with trust that nearly broke his resolve. He told her softly that they would face this together, that no matter what happened in the next hour, she would always have him. They entered the drawing room together, and conversation died immediately. Every eye turned to the Duke and the child beside him. Some faces showed confusion, others dawning comprehension, a few already registering shock or disapproval. Alexander walked to the center of the arranged space, Emma slightly behind him, but clearly present, clearly important to whatever was about to unfold. He began by thanking everyone for attending on short notice. He acknowledged that rumors had been circulating, and he intended to address them directly with truth rather than let speculation continue. His voice was steady, carrying authority earned through years of title and position. He noted that what he was about to reveal would surprise some, perhaps shock others, but he asked they listen completely before forming judgments. Then he told Sarah's story. He spoke of meeting her 20 years earlier, of falling genuinely in love despite class differences that made their relationship impossible in his father's eyes. He didn't spare himself, acknowledging his weakness in yielding to paternal pressure rather than fighting for what he claimed to value. He described Sarah's departure, his failure to search adequately, the years of not knowing what had become of her. He revealed that Sarah had been pregnant when she left, that she had tried to contact him, but his father had intercepted her communication, that she had raised their daughter alone for 2 years before dying, leaving the child in her sister's care. The room erupted in murmurs at this, people turning to neighbors with expressions ranging from sympathy to scandal. Alexander raised his hand for silence and continued. He explained that he had remained ignorant of Emma's existence until recently, when the scaffolding accident had begun revealing connections he should have discovered years earlier. He spoke of learning the truth, of meeting his daughter properly for the first time, of understanding what his choices had cost not just him, but an innocent child who deserved better. His voice roughened with emotion as he described the joy and grief of knowing Emma, of recognizing all the years they had lost. Then he brought Emma forward, his hand on her shoulder, presenting her to the assembled gathering. He stated formally that Emma Clark was his natural daughter, born of genuine love between himself and Sarah. He acknowledged her publicly as his child and his heir, stating his intention to provide for her fully through legal settlement and inheritance. He said anyone who questioned her place in his life or his family would answer to him directly. The silence that followed was profound. People stared at Emma, at Alexander, at each other, trying to process what they had just heard. Some faces showed sympathy, moved by the story's tragedy and the Duke's obvious emotion. Others displayed clear disapproval, scandalized by illegitimacy acknowledged so openly. A few seemed calculating, already considering how this changed social dynamics and alliances. Lord Pemberton stood first, moving to Alexander's side in clear demonstration of support. He addressed the room, noting that the Duke had shown remarkable courage in acknowledging past mistakes and claiming his daughter despite social consequences. He said anyone of honor would respect such honesty and accept Emma as what she was, an innocent child deserving protection rather than judgment. 3 months had passed since that November afternoon when Alexander had stood before county society and claimed his daughter. Winter had settled over Thornhaven with its characteristic quiet, snow covering the grounds in pristine white that softened the manor's stern architecture. Inside, the house felt different, warmer somehow, as though acknowledging truth had lifted a weight that had pressed down for generations. Emma divided her time between Clara's cottage and the manor, the arrangement working better than anyone had initially hoped. She attended village school during the week, maintaining friendships and normalcy, but spent weekends and holidays at Thornhaven learning from her father and aunt. The dual existence provided stability while allowing gradual adjustment to her changed circumstances. The social fallout had been mixed, as expected. Several families had cut ties with the Ashfords immediately, scandalized by Alexander's acknowledgement of illegitimacy. Others had surprised everyone by offering support, respecting the honesty if not approving the original circumstance. Most had adopted a wait-and-see attitude, neither endorsing nor condemning, watching to see how society at large would ultimately judge the situation. Alexander found he cared less about others' opinions than he had feared. The years of carefully maintaining reputation now seemed wasted compared to the simple joy of teaching Emma estate management, of hearing her call him Papa without hesitation, of watching her confidence grow as she understood her place in the world. Whatever social standing he lost was insignificant compared to what he had gained. Catherine had returned to London, but wrote frequently, reporting on efforts to secure Emma's future acceptance in broader society. She had found a progressive boarding school willing to accept Emma for the coming year, a place where other girls of complicated backgrounds studied alongside traditional nobility. The headmistress believed character mattered more than birth circumstances, and her institution's reputation protected students from casual cruelty. Clara had struggled initially with Emma's divided time, fearing she would lose the child she had raised. But Alexander had been careful to honor Clara's role, never suggesting Emma belonged more with him than with the woman who had mothered her through formative years. He ensured Clara received financial support that allowed her to reduce her sewing work, giving her more time with Emma when the girl was home. The arrangement preserved their bond while acknowledging new realities. The village's reaction had been perhaps the most surprising. Many working families, who might have been expected to resent Emma's elevation, instead expressed pride that one of their own had noble blood. They saw her as proof that worth existed beyond birth, that class barriers were more permeable than tradition suggested. Emma remained well-liked among village children, her essential kindness unchanged by knowledge of heritage. Margaret watched these developments with quiet satisfaction. She had witnessed the manor's gradual transformation from cold museum to actual home, had seen Alexander become more human and accessible than she had thought possible. The servants responded to the change, their work taking on new purpose when it served a family rather than maintaining empty traditions. Even Thomas admitted the household felt more alive than during all his previous years of service. The framed memorial to Sarah held place of honor in the drawing room, visible to all visitors. The daguerreotype, the joined ribbons and the locket were arranged artfully, creating shrine to the love that had produced Emma. Alexander found himself speaking of Sarah openly now, sharing memories with his daughter, no longer hiding the relationship that had shaped his life more profoundly than any other. Emma treasured these stories, building understanding of the mother she barely remembered. Lord Pemberton visited regularly, his friendship deepened by the crisis they had navigated together. He remarked once that Alexander seemed younger somehow, as though acknowledging Emma had lifted years of accumulated regret. The observation was accurate. Alexander felt lighter, freer, more capable of joy than at any point since youth. The weight of hidden truth and denied relationship had been crushing him without his full awareness. Its absence allowed him to breathe. On a bright January afternoon, Emma sat in Alexander's study, learning to read account books. She asked questions constantly, her quick mind grasping concepts that would challenge many adults. He watched her bent over the ledgers, seeing Sarah's intelligence combined with determination that might have been his own, or might have been uniquely hers. The miracle of her existence still sometimes overwhelmed him, the simple fact that this remarkable person carried his blood and Sarah's legacy. She looked up, catching his gaze, and smiled with uncomplicated affection. She said she was glad he had saved her from the scaffolding, glad the accident had brought them together, even though the circumstances were frightening. Without that moment, she might never have known him, never understood where she came from. Sometimes, she observed with childish wisdom, difficult things led to important truths. Alexander agreed quietly, thinking of all the paths not taken, the choices that had led to this moment. He had risked his life beneath falling timber, and in doing so had saved far more than Emma's body. He had saved his own capacity for love and honesty, had reclaimed possibilities he thought lost forever. The scaffolding's collapse had destroyed one structure, but allowed another to be built, stronger and truer than what preceded it. Outside, snow continued falling softly over Thornhaven's grounds, covering old scars and preparing ground for spring's eventual renewal. 3 months had passed since that November afternoon when Alexander had stood before county society and claimed his daughter. Winter had settled over Thornhaven with its characteristic quiet, snow covering the grounds in pristine white that softened the manor's stern architecture. Inside, the house felt different, warmer somehow, as though acknowledging truth had lifted a weight that had pressed down for generations. Emma divided her time between Clara's cottage and the manor, the arrangement working better than anyone had initially hoped. She attended village school during the week, maintaining friendships and normalcy, but spent weekends and holidays at Thornhaven learning from her father and aunt. The dual existence provided stability while allowing gradual adjustment to her changed circumstances. The social fallout had been mixed, as expected. Several families had cut ties with the Ashfords immediately, scandalized by Alexander's acknowledgement of illegitimacy. Others had surprised everyone by offering support, respecting the honesty if not approving the original circumstance. Most had adopted a wait-and-see attitude, neither endorsing nor condemning, watching to see how society at large would ultimately judge the situation. Alexander found he cared less about others' opinions than he had feared. The years of carefully maintaining reputation now seemed wasted compared to the simple joy of teaching Emma estate management, of hearing her call him Papa without hesitation, of watching her confidence grow as she understood her place in the world. Whatever social standing he lost was insignificant compared to what he had gained. Catherine had returned to London, but wrote frequently, reporting on efforts to secure Emma's future acceptance in broader society. She had found a progressive boarding school willing to accept Emma for the coming year, a place where other girls of complicated backgrounds studied alongside traditional nobility. The headmistress believed character mattered more than birth circumstances, and her institution's reputation protected students from casual cruelty. Clara had struggled initially with Emma's divided time, fearing she would lose the child she had raised. But Alexander had been careful to honor Clara's role, never suggesting Emma belonged more with him than with the woman who had mothered her through formative years. He ensured Clara received financial support that allowed her to reduce her sewing work, giving her more time with Emma when the girl was home. The arrangement preserved their bond while acknowledging new realities. The village's reaction had been perhaps the most surprising. Many working families, who might have been expected to resent Emma's elevation, instead expressed pride that one of their own had noble blood. They saw her as proof that worth existed beyond birth, that class barriers were more permeable than tradition suggested. Emma remained well-liked among village children, her essential kindness unchanged by knowledge of heritage. Margaret watched these developments with quiet satisfaction. She had witnessed the manor's gradual transformation from cold museum to actual home, had seen Alexander become more human and accessible than she had thought possible. The servants responded to the change, their work taking on new purpose when it served a family rather than maintaining empty traditions. Even Thomas admitted the household felt more alive than during all his previous years of service. The framed memorial to Sarah held place of honor in the drawing room, visible to all visitors. The daguerreotype, the joined ribbons, and the locket were arranged artfully, creating shrine to the love that had produced Emma. Alexander found himself speaking of Sarah openly now, sharing memories with his daughter, no longer hiding the relationship that had shaped his life more profoundly than any other. Emma treasured these stories, building understanding of the mother she barely remembered. Lord Pemberton visited regularly, his friendship deepened by the crisis they had navigated together. He remarked once that Alexander seemed younger somehow, as though acknowledging Emma had lifted years of accumulated regret. The observation was accurate. Alexander felt lighter, freer, more capable of joy than at any point since youth. The weight of hidden truth and denied relationship had been crushing him without his full awareness. Its absence allowed him to breathe. On a bright January afternoon, Emma sat in Alexander's study, learning to read account books. She asked questions constantly, her quick mind grasping concepts that would challenge many adults. He watched her bent over the ledgers, seeing Sarah's intelligence combined with determination that might have been his own, or might have been uniquely hers. The miracle of her existence still sometimes overwhelmed him. The simple fact that this remarkable person carried his blood and Sarah's legacy. She looked up, catching his gaze, and smiled with uncomplicated affection. She said she was glad he had saved her from the scaffolding, glad the accident had brought them together, even though the circumstances were frightening. Without that moment, she might never have known him, never understood where she came from. Sometimes, she observed with childish wisdom, difficult things led to important truths. Alexander agreed quietly, thinking of all the paths not taken, the choices that had led to this moment. He had risked his life beneath falling timber, and in doing so, had saved far more than Emma's body. He had saved his own capacity for love and honesty, had reclaimed possibilities he thought lost forever. The scaffolding's collapse had destroyed one structure, but allowed another to be built, stronger and truer than what preceded it. Outside, snow continued falling softly over Thornhaven's grounds, covering old scars and preparing ground for spring's eventual renewal.